national on 100 years of Communist Party of China. The second session is going to be presented by Dr. Biswajit Mohapatra. Sir is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. His area of research is international relations. Sir has written 2 books and published extensively on international relations and Look East, Act East, South China and Northeast Asia in peer-reviewed journals. Sir has presented and published several research articles in various national and international journals, conferences, and seminars. His area of interest includes political economy of India's foreign policy and national security, Asia-Pacific security, India, China, and East Asia relations, contemporary territorial and maritime disputes, regional economic integration. Sir's lecture topic is the Centenary of Chinese Communist Party and China's Rise. Now we request Sir to take over the forum.
Is the video on, ma'am? Oh, I have to on the video. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
No, sir, the video is not in on, sir.
Yeah, okay. I put on the video. Okay. Right.
Okay, sir.
Thank you very much for the for the nice introduction. I think at the outset, I must thank Professor Subramanian, who has taken a lot of interest in holding a debate, holding a kind of a webinar on Chinese Communist Party. And I've also seen that although Chinese Communist Party has completed 100 years, and it is supposed to have arose a lot of interest in the whole world. But when you talk of particularly India, I find the interest is also very little. But nonetheless, since the Congress and BJP, they did boycott the celebration, they didn't even talk about it, they didn't even mark any debate or discussion. But nonetheless, since Annamalai University Department of Political Science has organized this particular webinar on 100 years of Communist Party of China, it's a matter of great appreciation and also of great academic interest. I must congratulate Professor Subramanian and his team for taking great interest in this particular debate, and also to arise interest in our own academic community as to assess as to what has happened to China, how far China has gone, whether the political party system has really contributed towards. Sorry, just a minute, ma'am. I have to put it on here. Just a minute. Yeah, just give me a minute only. I forgot. I have to switch off the telephone. Just 1 second. Sometimes it so happens that we forget what is happening. All right. So when we start talking about, I think when we talk about China and the Communist Party, what I was saying is that we need to learn as to, although we teach political science, we teach political systems, we teach about the regional study or area studies and about the various countries and the political system, we need to also take interest to learn as to how a political system, a particular political party based system tends to whether contribute towards the growth of the nation or it tends to take the nation towards some other direction. So I think in this context, I have chosen a topic since also, when Chinese Communist Party was born, we were not around. So for me as a third generation, or as we call it in China, they call it the 5th generation leadership, which is now in place, which is now in charge of celebrating the so-called centenary of the Communist Party of China. And for me as a third generation, I also wanted to learn and observe as to how far the Communist Party based system in China has contributed towards China's rise, or it has taken so far. So that's how I have tentatively scheduled my topic, the centenary of Chinese Communist Party and China's rise. We all know whenever we teach international relations, our interest is drawn towards the fact that China is probably competing with the United States to be a kind of a major power. I'm not saying China is a superpower simply because China will take probably some more time to become a superpower of the kind that was seen during the Cold War between the US and Russia. But nonetheless, China is trying to be a major rival to United States and also is already a major power. and China's rise has really created a lot of concern, lot of curiosity in the minds of the international policy commentators, which has forced every one of us to understand the China's Communist Party's contribution towards China's rise, and also to draw the lessons where, if at all there is any, for other countries in the third world to grow as fast as China has grown in the last 100 years. I think before we go into the Chinese policies, since we are celebrating the 100 years of the centenary of the Communist Party of China, we need to also understand as to how Communist Party of China and Communist Party of China tend to have been born in a particular set of circumstances, and how it has grown from strength to strength, despite the fact that it has also, like human beings, it has also faced a lot of problems in its way to have completed 100 years as of today. And we know, since Chinese Communist Party was born in 1920, on July 1st, 1921, it was born in Shanghai in China. And we know after 28 years of struggle, I think, there is had there been time, we would have probably gone into many more issues to discuss. But since the period is 1.5 hours, and also despite the fact that we are dealing with a very, very gigantic topic centered on China, the lecture has been not very long, but because of the shortage of time. But nonetheless, we will try to understand as to how the Communist Party has been through a lot of struggles, and how that has given rise to a kind of a new kind of a reformist agenda. When you talk of reforms, we're not talking of political reformist agenda, but some kind of a policy reforms, if we can say, policy reforms agenda in the context of Chinese leadership, which has now taken China to a kind of a grand stand, as China has announced various grand strategies right from the time President Xi Jinping has taken over. So Communist Party of China was born quickly. If we go through the history, we'll see that on 1st of July 1921, Chinese Communist Party was born, or Communist Party of China was born in Shanghai in China, and they had to struggle for 28 years. And after struggle for 28 years, China finally won victory, and that is how Chinese Cultural Revolution took place in 1949, and modern day China, as we call it, or as political nomenclature wise, People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. So 28 years of struggle has contributed towards the modern day establishment of a modern day China in 1949. And Communist Party of China, as we know, during the time of Mao Zedong, has become the ruling party of mainland China, that is People's Republic of China. We also know that the Communist Party of China is basically based on the policy of ideology and politics, and we know how various strategies were followed during Mao Zedong's time, before Mao Zedong and his team won victory in 1949, and the state, and because of the typical Communist Party setup that China adopted in its own context, the Communist Party of China the state laws are passed by the National People's Congress of China, which as per the state's law and state's constitution. We also know that theoretically the Communist Party of China, although it is considered to be a very, very strong institution within the mainland China, we need to understand the Communist Party of China, although it's very powerful, it is still not a replacement for the Chinese government. In other words, China does have a government, as the Communist Party of China tends to be also existing as a political party structure. So here, theoretically, the CPC is very powerful. It is not a replacement of the government, although it is one of the most powerful institutions within the so-called mainland China. And we find that the Communist Party of China tend to conduct all its activities within the constitution, and that is how the political party, that is Communist Party of China, tend to be a constitutional party rather than an unconstitutional one. Whatever activities it tends to carry out, they are very much in sync or in consonance with the constitutional provisions of People's Republic of China. And all the party members, just to know, all the party members who are above 18 years of age can apply to become membership of the to become the member of the Communist Party of China if they tend to tend to approve the policies of the Communist Party of China, and can be also given membership by the Communist Party. And we know, from 1949, we know when we talk of Communist Party of China, we know that there have been kind of shifts as the leadership has changed. We tend to talk of Mao Zedong, who ruled China in 1949 at the completion of the Cultural Revolution. And we know the next hard man rule came up when Deng Xiaoping took over. And that is how, because of the new and unique and strong hand policies which were adopted by the so-called leadership of Chinese Communist Party, these political leaders tend to have carved out a niche for themselves in the so-called stage of world politics. And we know that in 1978, we know from 1949 when it comes to 1978, we know in December 1978, the third plenary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, which was held in December 1978, tend to have shifted the focus of party's work towards what is known as, within quote, socialist modernization. Because as you know, sometimes from 1949 till 1977, we find the Chinese Communist Party had also faced a lot of crisis, because there was this crisis between the so-called supporters of the capitalists and the so-called, sorry, hello, anything? Hello, are you able to hear me, or do you want to say something?
No, sir, you continue, sir. You please continue.
Ma'am, you mute the mics of others. Yeah, okay.
Sure, sir. Sorry for the disturbance, sir.
No problem, ma'am. In December 1978, we know that the 11th plenum, the third plenary of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China tend to have shifted its policies and the focus of the party's work towards a very declared objectives, which happens to be socialist modernization, policy reforms, and also an opening of the outside world. We know, I think, when we talk of China, we must be knowing that China had not opened up the world immediately in 1949. There were a lot of problems which China had to face internally and also externally. And by 1978, China decided to not only reiterate its own commitment to socialist modernization, as it is a communist party dedicated to establishment of a socialist and communist society. And we know that in 1978 also is a watermark for China, because it opened up China to the world stage, or to open up to the outside world. And that is where China probably started to develop external foreign relations with the foreign countries in search of its own growth and policy influence. And we know any China, and we talk about and when you talk of the Chinese Communist Party, I think sometimes when you talk of the even in the centenary years of Communist Party of China, we probably will be committing a mistake when we think that probably all the members of the whole population of China is probably the member has accepted the membership of the Chinese Communist Party. But when you see the record, we find since China tends to be the most populous country in the world today, yet we cannot say that the whole population happens to be the member of the Communist Party of China. But we see that although the whole population may not have accepted the membership of the Communist Party of China, yet Chinese Communist Party or Communist Party of China tends to have a large base amongst the so-called population that seems to be existing within China. And here we find that the membership of the Communist Party of China rose from mere figure of 70 in 1921 to up to over 66 million in 2002. And when we see the record in 2017, we find 87.79 million people were member of the Communist Party of China. And when we talk of 2021, when China is celebrating the centenary of the Communist Party of China, we find that almost more than 95 millions of people happen to be members of the Communist Party of China. So anyway, so we find that China, although it's a communist country, yet we find that the whole population is not the member of has not accepted the membership of the Communist China, and yet a large number of people, 95 millions of people, tend to have become members of the Communist Party of China. So here we can say the Chinese political party, Communist Party of China, tends to have a large base among the so-called existing population of China, and that shows that how the Communist Parties of China's policies have been liked by the Chinese population, and they have accepted the Chinese Communist Party of China's policies and also its constitution, and have accepted the membership of the so-called Communist Party. And here we find that, and when you talk of the little bit of structure, we know that Communist Party, I think people are aware of the Communist Party structure, that the Communist Party tends to have its General Assembly, which is known as the National People's Congress, And this National People Congress tends to meet every 5 years, and it tends to elect what is known as the Secretariat, or what we popularly know as the Politburo, which is the highest decision-making body in case of the Communist Party of China. And we find that this Central Committee or Politburo tends to be comprising of 7 members, which tends to be the highest decision-making body within the Communist Party of China. And we find that while the National People's Congress is held in every 5 years, and we find that for the 5 years period at a stage, the Politburo or the Central Committee tends to take all the decisions and tends to frame policies for the party, and which is also followed by the government. So here, why we are talking of National People's Congress and we are talking of Politburo? Because as you know, that today's today's strongman, as the world calls him, because of the fact that President Xi Jinping tends to have exhibited a kind of a strong exterior in terms of his own personality makeup, in terms of his personal determination, and also in terms of the various policies that he has announced during his reign, which started from 2012. The National People Congress of 2012 tend to assume a large importance, because it was in this National People's Congress in 2012, which was held on from November 8 to November 14, President Xi Jinping was elected as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China. So that is where we find that since he has been elected by the National People's Congress, he tends to exercising the power of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China. And President Xi Jinping tends to also, after having elected as the General Secretary in 2012, as per the tradition of the Communist Party of China, he got appointed as the president in 2013, president of the Republic of China. So at the moment, we can see that he not only exercises power as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, he also is the president of the Chinese nation, or president of the People's of China since 2013. And when we go a little towards the last, we'll see as to how the policies from 2013 to 2020 tends to have acquired new dimensions compared with the earlier policies which were accepted by the earlier leadership of the Communist Party of China. And here we find that when we talk of the little bit ideology, we need to understand that while we talked of the socialist modernization, we need to also understand the ideology of the Communist Party tends to be comprising of Marxism-Leninism and also Mao Zedong's ideas. Because Mao Zedong is the great leader who had taken the Communist Party of China towards victory in 1949. Mao Zedong's ideas also tend to have a lot of influence in the policy making processes of the so-called Communist Party of China. And we find and the Chinese Communist Party also tends to have, as of today, more than 4.36 million branches in the grassroots or in various levels of the within the Chinese society. And so that shows that how Chinese Communist Party tends to be largely mass-based, and also tends to have a great great clamor within the population of the Communist Party of China, which tends to have attracted more than 95 million of people into the realm of the membership of the Communist Party of China. And we find that when President Xi Jinping tends to have been elected as the General Secretary of the Communist China in 2012 and assumed presidency in 2013, we find that China particularly has taken a kind of a shape, or taken a kind of a growth curve in politics, which was unseen before his taking over the power, or in the context of his various predecessors who had occupied the position of the General Secretaryship of the Communist Party of China. And the idea of when you turn to understand whether China's rise is synonymous with the rise of Xi Jinping or not, that can be found out when we go through the lecture, and we tend to come across the various issues which will give us an idea whether, as I said, the problem that I want to discuss about, whether China's rise is Xi Jinping's rise, or President Xi Jinping's rise is also China's rise. So that is where we find, when we want to understand whether President Xi Jinping is singularly an important figure in contributing towards the China's rise, we need to go through his first speech that he gave as the elected General Secretary of the Communist Party of China. I think in his first speech, as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, President Jinping, as it has been said by the world over, that he made a promise to tackle China's problems, and he did not promise any, and he didn't promise any of the reforms that the world was looking forward to. The question here is why? Where was the need of reform if the Communist Party of China had been able to smoothly elect President Xi Jinping as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China? I find we need to understand that before Xi Jinping took over as the General Secretary, the Chinese Communist Party had come across a lot of problems which were primarily concerned with the problem of corruption that existed amongst the so-called party leadership. And that is how I think, when he took over the leadership, he promised to tackle the problems which were existing within the Communist Party of China, and also he wanted to have some kind of a reform which has gone, that we'll discuss, as to how to make China a most powerful country as of world today. And when you talk of most powerful, it's within quote, because China is now an unparalleled power just beside the United States of America, economically, politically, and also, as we say, strategically. Because we will see that President and Xi Jinping, when in his first speech, appeared to be very plain spoken and appeared to have promised to address the problems within the country's Communist Party, ruling party, to fight corruption, and he also promised to continue with the country's rejuvenation. In other words, President Xi Jinping only promised that he will only tackle the problem of corruption that had come up during his predecessor, President Hu Jintao's term, or Hu Jintao's period, and he did not promise any kind of a policy, any kind of a change in the Communist Party of China's policies. Rather, he promised that he will continue with the country's rejuvenation, which was a policy and program of the Communist Party of China. And we find that Communist Party of China tend to face problems of corruption among the party and officials, where we find that the party leadership was faced with corruption and taking bribes, and the Communist Party was also criticized by its own party cadres, that it was out of touch with the so-called people, and also there was undue emphasis. It was said that the Communist Party of China during President Hu Jintao's time had also given undue emphasis on formalities and also bureaucracy, etc. And all these three factors were presumed to have contributed, or were thought to have been obstacles in the growth of Chinese economy and also in the growth of China's ascendancy in power. Because we know when internal contradictions seem to be very much prevalent within the party or within a nation, those internal obstructions tend to obstruct the country or the nation on its growth to powerful status, as the country may be looking forward to. So when all these internal problems were there, Xi Jinping promised that he would certainly tackle all these problems, and he would also be able to, and he would also continue with the policy of rejuvenation, as was the policy of the Communist Party of China. And in his own first speech, Xi Jinping tend to have promised that he would try to work to improve the citizen lives. He would also be trying to provide for better schooling of the children of the Chinese population, and he would be able to provide more stable jobs to the Chinese population, simply because without stable jobs, as you know, the economy seems to be in doldrum, and if one is to rectify the economy, one is to make the economy growth oriented, then one is to provide adequate jobs to the population. And since we know unemployment tends to be the biggest bane of any kind of sound economic growth, and here we find that to understand his leadership makeup, to understand his personality makeup, he tend to have promised that he would offer better stable jobs to Chinese population. He would also offer more satisfying income to people, where everybody will be contributing towards the economic growth and political stability of the country. He also promised that there will be more reliable social services, as was being looked forward to by the Chinese population. And he also seemed to have also promised better housing conditions to people. So when you talk of the conditions, we understand that at the time of Xi Jinping's taking over of the Chinese Communist Party leadership, China was relatively a poorer country, and besides facing internal political problem of corruption, then what it is today. When we talk of today's China and we talk of 210 or 212 when Xi Jinping took over, China has been able to take a giant leap, a gigantic leap in terms of economic growth, in terms of political stability, and also we'll see in terms of what we call it power calculus. And here we find, in other words, Xi Jinping was very, I don't want to say he's clever, but he was very strategic to, to be able to win over the support of the large membership base of the Communist Party of China and the Chinese population. He tended to have promised to the Chinese population that the children of the children of the Chinese people would be able to grow up in much better conditions, in much better circumstances, where they would be able to find much better work, and also they'll be able to live in better conditions. So, and this, why we talk about it, because we want to understand as to what was the policy makeup of Xi Jinping at the time of his taking over of the Chinese, of the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and what is his makeup in terms of policies as of today, when Communist Party of China is completing 100 years. So here, if we quote Xi Jinping's policy from his speeches, he said that his policy would be that people striving for better life will be the goal that he would work for. In other words, if you have to quote, people striving for better life is the goal that we are struggling for. So he identified his own policies to be people-friendly policies, and where he promised a lot of reforms in terms of internal environment, internal conditions, in order to be able to have a strong leadership or strong control over the political party, and also to contribute towards China's rise. And why I'm talking China's rise? Because when we talk of these points, we tend to understand that probably he not only gave vent to his own being a very sagacious political leader, he was also a great strategician, which was probably not thought about when he was taking over power in 2012. And that is how, when you look about the criticism which is being made against Xi Jinping today, we'll find that probably the world did not think of him to become as powerful a leader as he has become today, and in the process he is perceived to be a threat to the so-called world powers that are existing in the world today, or world powers that be including that of United States of America. So anyway, so here we find that President Xi Jinping at the time of taking over of the leadership of the Communist Party of China tend to have faced not only numerous internal problems, he was also faced with a lot of rivalry amongst the so-called well-connected offsprings of the past communist leaders, from whom he had some kind of a threat of being overruled by the so-called what we call princelings, or the children of the past Communist Party leaders. And here we find that he also faced a kind of a factionalized Communist Party, where the various factions were trying to compete with each other in order to be able to influence the Chinese Communist Party of China's policy making, rather than trying to present a kind of a consensus policy framework which would have guided the Communist Party of China. So here we find that at the time of taking over, Xi Jinping not only faced the political problems which the party was facing, he also faced the problems of faction within Communist Party. He also faced the problems of competition from the so-called well-connected offsprings of the past leaders of the Communist Party of China, who had also threatened him of creating or constituting certain factions which would obstruct his way of functioning, and to take China to the kind of a grand stand, as we say, that the country is now based on, or has reached so far. So here we find that this rise of China was something, and the rise of Xi Jinping was also not something which was not unknown, because we find that since 2007 and his appointment as the General Secretary, he was expected, as he was named, since 2007, his appointment as the General Secretary of the Communist Party was very much known to the Communist Party leadership, and also to the Communist Party members, simply because that in 2007 he was named as the successor to the then president and the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, Hu Jintao. So from 2007, I think Xi Jinping has been able to take in interest, since he will be the heir apparent, as we call it. Yeah, the heir apparent as the, within quote, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China in 2012 in the National People's Congress. Xi Jinping had been able to expose himself to the kind of politics and the policies which were there within the Communist Party of China. And Xi Jinping, in his first speech, he also reiterated the party's commitment to the masses. He also reiterated that he also called for the heroism of the people, and in the same first speech, he also called for the need to root out corruption, which had come to sort of beef of the party. So here we find that because of his inner knowledge about the Communist Party and because of his keen interest in the effects of the Communist Party, he had been able to very, very precisely coin the kind of challenges which he had to tackle when he would be appointed as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, and which he became in 2012. And we find that in the first speech, we find that Xi Jinping spoke very frankly. He showed his frank side of the personality, and he also showed consideration for the people. As we discuss these policies, it shows that he showed to be a people-friendly political leader rather than the so-called political leaders which we find in the so-called Western democracies, where we find that the leadership of the political party, instead of being closely associated with the people, tend to be far removed from their supporters, and that tends to that tends to be the cause of many a problem which we find in the so-called quote-unquote democracies. Anyway, so here we find that Xi Jinping showed his frank side of his personality, and he also showed his concern for the people, and he also tend to, and here we find that he also tend to have exhibited or demonstrated his human touch or human face. And in the words of a professor of Chinese University of Political Sciences Law, having said that he spoke with a human touch. I think when the Chinese society was facing enormous crisis, and as we talked of the so-called poverty, which was very much present in the Chinese society, we find that his speeches came or provided the much needed balm or relief to the people's mind and desires, and the kind of, I don't want to say broken hearts, but people's desires which tend to have brought Xi Jinping very close to the people's desires or people's dreams. And some also said that when people assessed his first speech, they seem to have also coined the phrase that in China, perhaps there would be a new beginning. And that is what some commentators tend to have felt. And we find that word came true as we go through the history of China's rise, right from Xi Jinping's rule in 2012 till 2021. And we find that, according to Jim Hang, another professor of Santo University in Guangdong province, he said that in the first speech, when he analyzed this first speech of the General Secretary Xi Jinping, and it is seen that Xi had mentioned the word party 20 times during his first speech. And not only he mentioned party for 20 times, he also tend to have mentioned people in 19 times, and tend to have also reiterated responsibility of the party, Communist Party of China, towards the people something like 10 times. And we also find when he promised that he would tackle problems of the Communist Party of China, the internal problems which included corruption, that party word tend to have mentioned 3 times in the whole speech. But however, according to a critic, the speech is unique in the sense that the first speech of Xi Jinping did not mention the words which we are familiar with, a student of democracy, like rule of law, constitution, or law, or democracy, or freedom. So that shows also that Xi Jinping had probably been quite well trained in the so-called ideology and values of the Communist Party of China, since we find that the democracy, freedom, rule of law, constitution, they seem to be more in the vocabulary of the vocabulary of the so-called democracies rather than in any kind of a communist party system. So here we find Mr. Xi Jinping, since we said in the beginning, he promised continuation of the Communist Party of Rejuvenation. In the first speech, it was very clear that he was not in favor of any kind of fundamental political reform that he was going to initiate in the context of the Communist Party of China. So when we tend to analyze his personality at the time of taking over the power, we find that he was very much a communist cadre, which is what he is expected to be, because you are a member of the Communist Party and he had served in the Communist Party all these years. And we also find that he tend to have not indicated any concern for any kind of fundamental reform that he would bring about within the structure of the Communist Party. So he was very much a well-trained traditional communist cadre, and he also did not tend to have given any kind of importance that he would be able to bring about the reforms as were brought about either by Mao Zedong or by Deng Xiaoping. So here we find that, and also we need to understand that at the time of taking over the power as the General Secretary, he also did not enjoy either the stature or the influence or the kind of authority that was enjoyed by Mao Zedong within the Communist China, and also the same by Deng Xiaoping. And we find that, and here we find that as we talked about, the Communist Party of China tends to have the National People's Congress, which tends to be responsible for the election of the so-called Secretariat or the Central Committee, or we call it the Politburo. And at the time of taking over of the General Secretary, it was also seen that the Politburo tend to have been consisting of not only 7 members, but most of the members were also very much aged, and we talked about that the members also will be retiring in about 5 years' time, which will be probably consuming much of the time and concern of Xi Jinping, which would probably obstruct Xi Jinping from adopting any kind of grand policy that he would be expected to take in the context of his own presidency of presidency of People's Republic of China. So here we find the aged, the political members were very much aged. So he was lucky in the sense that he was not beset with the so-called political members who would be enjoying the same term as Xi Jinping was to enjoy for 2 terms as within the under the provisions of the Communist Party of China. So the idea of telling is that he assumed power in the Communist Party at the right time, where he probably would be able to have fresh blood or new people in the Politburo, which would probably act in support of his policies rather than would be posing a kind of a power rival challenge to his policies, which would have complicated his policies as the leader and the president of the Communist Party, president of the People's Republic of China. So here we find when Xi Jinping took over power as the General Secretary, he was only 59, and we find his number 2, Li Keqiang. I think he is also famous. He later on became the Prime Minister. He was at the age of 57, and we find that why you're talking, because relatively when the political leaders were very, very old, very, very aged, they were in the mid-60s. The Xi Jinping was in 59, less than 60 years of age, which showed that he will continue to be in power for 2 years as the General Secretary, as provided under the Constitution, and also his Prime Minister was also relatively younger as he was while he was appointed as the Prime Minister. And we find the Xi Jinping before he took over as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, we find that Xi Jinping was the Vice President of the so-called of the political party. And we find the Communist Party, and we find he was not only Vice President, he was also the so-called Vice, and in 2013 he was promoted to be the Vice Chairman of the Chinese Military Commission, the other powerful decision-making body as far as defense policy are concerned. And when he was appointed as the Vice Chairman of the Chinese Military Commission, it was an indication or precursor to his subsequent appointment as the General Secretary or the Party Chief of the Party Chief in 2012. And we find when he was taking over power, we find that China had enjoyed a relatively, although it was not a very rich country, it was a poorer country, there was poverty, but here China had also been doing subsequently relatively well in its own economy, as was not the case in many other countries. So in 2010, it was seen that before Xi Jinping took over, China had been able to surpass the Japanese economy and had become the second largest economy in 2010. In 2014, we find the China's economy, after Xi Jinping took over, China's economy tend to have surpassed the US economy in terms of, when we take into account the purchase parity, what we call it, the purchasing power parity valuation of a country's GDP. However, we find when we compare Chinese economy with the US economy, we find China in 2014, it was seen China's economy had almost been able to become to be of the size of 40% of the US economy. We all know the United States is the biggest economy of the world, and China had been able, China's economy size had been of equivalent to 40% of the US economy, and whereby in 2019 it was seen that China had been able to have a size of US economy up to 60%. So here we see that China had been able to have a relatively economic rise compared with the world's largest economy, that is United States of America. The question here is that why we are talking of Chinese economy rise and how does it contribute to the nation's rise? Because we all know that behind the political rise, economic growth or economic story or the story of economic growth tends to contribute the largest ever potential for the country's political rise in terms of power. And that is how when you find that when the China's economy had been growing very well, we find that certainly was expected to contribute towards China's policy making steps, which we see were taken after Xi Jinping had been able to establish his complete control over that of the Communist Party and also over that of the Chinese leadership. And we find that China's new leaders under Xi Jinping had inherited the unprecedented economic success which China had been able to achieve over the last 30 years. So by the time the Xi Jinping and his team had been able to inherit a kind of a Chinese society, a Chinese economy, which had enjoyed an unprecedented economic growth in the last 30 years. And we also find that these changes tend to have contributed towards China's proclamation of grand policies, as they are called, which tend to have become the world's headache or tends to have become world's concern as of today. When you talk of matters like regional security, when you talk of matters like world security, and also we tend to talk of the so-called multilateralism as they are present in the world. So as China became more powerful economically, politically, and militarily, we find that China's global reach tend to have also got expanded. Because when you have more money, when the economy is very strong, the country can spend more money on the defense, can spend more money on the acquisition of armaments, and that tends to be and also tends to go for a rapid military modernization, which tends to make the country a threat to its own neighbors and also to other countries of the world, which may be having some kind of a military threat. So China's success economically, politically, tend to have also contributed towards military success, where China was able to rapidly modernize its own army, and we find that these global reach also got expanded because President Xi Jinping during his own time, when you look through the literature, you'll find that he has not only been able to make some grand policy announcements, he also tend to have projected a more nationalistic and assertive China. This nationalistic and assertive China tend to have posed a lot of problem to our own maintenance of balanced relations in the world and also the so-called multilateralism. And we find President Xi Jinping and his own personal ambition and his ascendance in the Communist Party of China tend to have led him to announce grand policies, which are known as today, when you talk about grand policy, we know the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's a separate item. we can talk about on some other day. But then Belt and Road Initiative tends to be such a gigantic plan that it tends to be covering almost more than half of the world in terms of various sensitive and economic commercial locations, which could probably give China a lot of economic resources, as we call it, economic muscles, and also military muscles in terms of the support that it can win from the so-called friendly countries who join China in the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which can make China a kind of a unchallenged power and unchallenged power vis-a-vis that of United States of America. So the personal ambitions of the President Xi Jinping and also the Chinese economy tend to have contributed to tends to have enthused President Xi Jinping to make this grand policy announcement like Belt and Road Initiative. It also led him for power consolidation, led him also to declare a lot of foreign policy reforms, and also tend to have led him to announce and adopt comprehensive depending reforms within the so-called within China, which tend to have made China today a military power to reckon with, almost to the status of the other power when we compare with the United States of America. We find that Xi Jinping's political policy tend to have this political program tend to have called for China a more united and confident of its own value system and also political structures. So that shows that how President Xi Jinping has been able to make these grand policy announcements, which because of its supposed coverage or reach of the various countries tend to have made China a power to reckon with, and also tend to be symbolic or representative of an assertive China, or of a militarily powerful China, and also of a nationalistic China, because China, by adopting its various policies under Xi Jinping, tend to be directed towards making China a much more stronger power today than what it was before. So that is where, when you talk of nationalism, nationalism tends to be more inward oriented than outward. So whenever you say we are nationalists, it's a matter of concern for the other people, because you will be looking more inward rather than outward. So the so-called society, which is supposed to ensure everyone's survival, tends to become a problem when any country or any nation or any person tends to become more nationalistic than anyone else, simply because that shows more inward-looking policies aimed at energizing, aimed at strengthening one's own power potential, rather than aimed at ensuring the same for everyone else. So here we find, since 2009, we find that President Xi Jinping tend to have adopted a grand strategy, which tends to have, before he took over in 2012, we find China had been able, because of China's policies, the whole of East Asia and the world tend to have become more volatile, with various tension and disputes, which involve China in the Korean Peninsula, in East China Sea, in South China Sea, and also in other parts of the world, where China's involvement in this power tend to have also come to the attention of the world powers. So when President Xi Jinping tend to have announced the grand strategy, as we saw in the context of Belt and Road Initiative, we find these foreign policy announcements and actions of Xi Jinping were perceived to make China a kind of make China to be perceived in a much more negative manner than what it was in 2009. Why we say that? Because by the time Xi Jinping took over, the US-China relations had already reached a worse end than what it was before. And because of the Xi Jinping's so-called policy pronouncements, we find that these tend to have also become another thorn in the relationship between US and China, simply because US and China relations were not anywhere better than it was some 20 to 30 years ago. Because 2009, we find China's assertive policies tend to have also contributed towards arousing of suspicion in the minds of the power about China's design, and also China's and consequences of China's strategies, which would be felt by the countries who were more volatile and because of their existence very close to China. And here you find that Xi's foreign policy also tend to have perceived any kind of anti-China hostility anti-China hostility from the West and tend to have also not taken it very kindly. Because, and since the President Xi Jinping policy was nationalistic, he and his party and his leadership were not trying to appreciate other countries' policies, which were anti-China in nature, and they tend to have considered those anti-China policy as very, very hostile. And we know when any nation considers any nation's policies as hostile, there is a possibility of a military conflict. If we wonder as to why military conflict is taking place, that's another story. But nonetheless, we find that most of the time China and US tend to have been locked in some kind of a conflict over any kind of a geopolitical situation, simply because both the countries tend to be interested in having as much influence as they can on the world stage today. So President Xi Jinping tend to have called US-China relations in the contemporary world as a new type of great power relations, because China is angling for a great power status. Under Xi Jinping's regime, we find that Xi Jinping tend to have categorized US-China relations as a new set of relations, and the new type of relations of a great power relations. And we find that China tends to have also, and since we find that China tends to have also not taken very kindly the US, what is the time now? The US policies of the US pivot to Asia in a very positive manner, simply because China has not only come up with a reactionary policy of string of pearls, China tends to have also called the US policy pivot of Asia, simply because China tends to consider US to be a third party power in the region, and China tend to have called for some kind of an Asian regionalism where it is called upon the Asian powers to settle their differences within their own country, within their own region, and not involve any third party power that with reference to United States of America. So here, because China tends to consider US as a rival in the so-called major power setup in the great power relations, China tends to be cultivating relations with many other countries, including East Asia, where it tends to want to keep United States away from the so-called, from its own geopolitical influential domain that it tends to enjoy in Asia and also in other parts of the world. And we find that China has called for Asian regionalism, and to quote President Xi Jinping in a lecture that he gave it to in the Belt and Road Forum, he says he has called for a win-win cooperation with the United States, where he said that we should force a new type of relations, which will be forced on win-win relations rather than any kind of relation which will make China to be at a lower stage. And here we find the question here remains that, and today I think when we talk of China's rise, and we find that when China has been able to enjoy in its own esteem, which is also being perceived by the other countries of the world, that China tends to have become a great power from being a power, from being a medium power, it is now become almost a great power. We find that China is almost trying to claim the status of a world power, which is equivalent to that of United States of America. Although China still is way behind United States in terms of economic power, in terms of other military power, because today we know the United States tends to be the most militarily powerful nations. We also need to know that China, although it has been able to spend more money because of the economic surplus that it's able to enjoy within its own economy, to be able to invest more money in modernizing its own military, yet China is now caught up with the United States to claim a kind of a major power status, which was unseen, which was unheard of, which was unheard of in the earlier decades. So here we find when China and US tend to be caught up in some kind of a rivalry in the political sector and in the political arena and also in other arena, we tend to see that China's rise tend to have become a kind of a matter of substantial debate, substantial perception, which tend to be now influencing the so-called world events, world events in various parts of the world, where the Chinese perception and US perceptions tend to matter much more than the perception of the regional powers, or tend to matter as the perception of any other power. So here, if we at all conclude that China's rise has been very, very substantial right from 2012 till today. And when China is celebrating the centenary of the Communist Party of China, as to what are the lessons for the world. When you compare the Communist Party system with the so-called democratic systems which are existing in other parts of the world, is there anything that we need to learn? Because here we find that although Chinese Communist Party tend to have continued the political rejuvenation, although it has not been able to bring about any kind of a fundamental political change, as has been the need or cry of the various people within the democratic party setup. We find that Chinese Communist Party's reach to the people of almost nearly to more than 2/3 of the population tend to have made the political party more people based and rather than any other political party that we find in the so-called democratic world. So this is number one nation, is that the outreach of the party tend to have become a matter of a substantial proportion that we find in the context of the another political party setup. Then the question that we need to learn from Chinese growth is that strong and stable leadership. Although Communist Party system tends to be authoritarian in nature, tends to be veering around one particular person who tends to enjoy so much of authority, which cannot be talked about in other parts in case of other in case of other members or leaders. We tend to also learn that there is strong leadership within the political party tends to contribute towards the strengthening of the economy of a country than what we see in the concept democratic world, where we find that our leadership, because it is fragmented, because it is scattered, and the power tends to be shared by too many people, the country's economy tends to be rather in the doldrum, as is not the case in case of China. When you talk of a strong, stable leadership, please remember, I am not advocating an authoritarian leadership, but I am saying that there should be a strong leadership. And as you know, that strong leadership cannot be equated with an authoritarian leadership, because when you have a leadership, the leadership can be strong, yet does not have to be authoritarian. But in case of when we have to learn lessons from China, we need to understand that a strong, stable leadership of a political party tends to go a long way in contributing towards the strengthening of the economy and ushering in political stability of a particular country, which tend to lay down the firm basis for the growth of a strong country, economically, politically, and also, if you like, militarily. Because as you know, since the regional threat since the military threat has not disappeared completely from the world, even though and there is the presence of nuclear weapons, and there is the presence of various other political conflicts, which also includes terrorism, and here we find the military power, assuming military power, is also very important. The third lesson that we need to understand from China is although China is criticized for lack of freedom, for lack of so-called respect for people's rights, yet we need to understand that and then here we understand that probably the duty performance, one's own performance in one's own given sphere within the country, within the political system, is of great importance than merely talking of rights. We know that the Chinese Communist Party also talks of rights of the people, rights of leadership, and although we read about the various Western countries report that China tends to be not respecting the so-called human rights of the people, including the workers. Yet we see that some kind of a respect for the rights of the people must be there in China, which tend to make people to obey China and the Chinese policies and to respect China's constitution. Then what is not the case in case of our own countries? I think some kind of insistence on the performance of our own profession, of our own dedication, tend to go a long way in contributing towards the country's rise than what is merely talked about. I think, and then I did not go into, because of the possible time, I didn't go into China, the Indo-Pacific policy. I didn't go into the Belt and Road Initiative in great detail because there will be another lecture, although it could have been there, but because of the fact that we're talking of China's rise, we need to understand whether the political leadership tends to be contributing towards the country's rise, and what has been in particular the contribution of Xi Jinping. I wanted to bring in his personality. I wanted to bring in his policies. I also wanted to discuss them in the context of the Chinese Communist Party of China's rise and growth in today's world, where we would be able to learn lessons in terms of political leadership, in terms of national strategies, and also most importantly, in terms of the so-called political parties outreach to people, where more supporters within a political party tends to mean more strength to that political party, which also subsequently contributes toward the political party's rise in the power hierarchy of the country and tends to make it a kind of a ruling party. I think I will stop here, and if there are any questions, I will be able to take questions and we can discuss much more. Thank you for a patient hearing.
Excuse me, sir.
And I hope my voice was audible. I hope I have been able to at least touch your minds and been able to arise some kind of a concern in you as far as the global politics is concerned vis-a-vis that of China. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, ma'am.
Actually, my name is Aishwarya and I would like to ask a doubt.
Yeah, please ask.
Yeah, so do you think that economical rise in China is of its spreading trade or its inside values?
When you talk of economy, I think, because you have to go into, now when you talk about trade and economic policies, you find that much of the economic dividend is earned by the external policies, which we tend to call it popularly trade and commerce. And we know, and when you talk of the policies become more interconnected now. I think when you talk of the Belt and Road Initiative, you'll come to know the Belt and Road Initiative is combining both geopolitics and also geoeconomics. In the sense that it is now trying to promote economic growth, it's also trying to sort of direct it towards the alteration of a geopolitical structure where, with the trade surplus, the countries also would remain connected with the main country, which is the force behind any kind of economic policies. So here, previously economic policies were more internal than external. Now we find economic policies are more external than internal, because within a particular country, the economy may get probably limited by the internal circumstances than what it can achieve when it is exposed to external circumstances. I think in this context, if you talk of the BRI, if you talk of the CPEC, you'll find that although they are economic policies, but they are also both economic and political policies, which is trying to give them double dividend than what merely economic policies used to be in the decades earlier.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Shaukat, now you can go with your question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Shaukat, research scholar of public administration under the supervision of Professor Shaktivel, sir.
Right.
My question is, sir, if the goal of the communism is a stateless society, can we say that the goal of a communism is a stateless society?
Yeah, when you talk of stateless society, what has been the cause behind the origin of the state? The state is merely a kind of a regulatory structure. That the state has come up as a kind of a structure which is aimed at regulating the human behavior and also then also trying to give a kind of a stability to the human society. When you go back to contractualist, you will see that the state is a political contrivance, and which has been created or constituted by the people themselves. And here, when the communism tends to talk of a stateless society, what it means that the Marx tends to have imagined that when people tend to become self-regulated, when people tend to become self-disciplined, when people tend to be performing their duties, tend to be doing their things without any external supervision, then there will be no need for a state. Because you should also understand, as per in the Marxian parlance, state is also a kind of a exploitative structure, because it is found that the state tends to also exploit the people who are not in the echelons of power. And that is how Marx tend to have talked about the class of rich and the poor. And when you talk of the state, you'll find that the definition of the state as is given in the Communist Manifesto is that the modern day executive, which is known as government, the modern day executive of the state is nothing but an instrument in the hands of the bourgeois, which tends to work for the protection and preservation of the interests of the bourgeois. Bourgeois means the rich sections. And since the state tends to not work for the poor, for the have-nots, and it tends to be in the hands of the rich and tends to work for protection and preservation and enhancement of the interests of the rich, he called the state to be an organ of exploitation, or to be an agency of exploitation. And because the state was perceived to be not work to be a kind of obstacle in the growth of the poor, and he wanted that since it is exploiting the poor, and any such exploitative organization or institution must go away. And that's how he showed in his own writing that the state, since it is not working for the poor, the workers at one point in time will rise up in revolt against the state. It will lead to the collapse of the state. And when the people tend to be in the socialist society, and that says since it will be run by the socialists, by the proletariat, they will be doing away with the capitalists. There will be no need for any kind of a structure. And when people will realize that they are trying to run their own society, they're trying to do their things in their own way, there will be no need for any kind of a state which was within quote an exploitative structure or a structure of exploitation. So that will happen only when people would become self-disciplined, when people will become self-responsible, and when people will only be working for their own good and not trying to harm others.
Okay, sir. Got it, sir. Sir, in the beginning of the presentation, you talked about the USA as well as the China. Could we consider China as an alternate source of power? Because as USA has hegemonized the whole world, they dominated the whole world in terms of culture, in terms of education system. Can we consider China as an alternate power?
In terms of power politics, we need to understand that once a country tends to have acquired a greater amount of power, there is no way to control that country from exercising its own power to, as you said, to exercise hegemonic influence. So, since US is the world's greatest power, we tend to call US the hegemon. But there is a fear also which is expressed against China that if China goes to that state, China also would be exercising that much of power like a hegemon than what it is perceived to be. So here China can, because in terms of power politics, they are caught up in power rivalry in terms of acquiring influence over the other countries, and given the fact that China's policies which are being opposed in the context of CPEC or in the context of the BRI, where China's policies tend to be more based on exploitation of the resources for its own development and trying to be more making the countries debt-ridden. China is almost exercising the power of a mini hegemon. The only thing when saying there will be not two hegemon, we tend to call US a hegemon because that is the parlance that we see. But we need to also be a little bit wary of the fact that if China tends to become any day a world superpower, it will also be as hegemonic as the United States can project it to be.
Exactly, sir. But sir, USA has hegemonized the whole world in terms of the culture as well. The developing countries, does they have any strategy so that they can prevent themselves from the hegemonization?
No, that is where, because what is happening is the developing countries can only prevent any kind of hegemonic influence being exercised on them only when they grow their economy on sound lines. Because then we find that there is a very little possibility, because as we talk of today, when you talk of globalization is again an instrument of the neo-capitalist, where the capitalist mode of production, which is being forced to be adopted by more and more poorer countries, tend to make the poorer countries more dependent on the West rather than make it self-dependent. I think and then until the countries become self-dependent, until the countries become self-powerful, there will be very little scope for the countries to not to fall into the trap of either call it any kind of hegemonic influence which is exercised by United States or by China or by any other interested power.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Participant, Mr. Said Alavi, you can ask your question.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody.
Dr.
Sir, I am Saidalavi CK from Kerala, research scholar under Dr. R. Murthy, Department of Political Science, Namal University. Sir, audible? Is it audible?
Yeah, very audible. Yeah, very audible.
Okay, sir. I would like to express my great pleasure and thanks to participating in this national webinar. In this national webinar conducted by our department, especially respected HOD, Dr. C. Subramanian sir. Also, thanks to marvelous presentation, Dr. Biswajit Mohapatra, who gave us enormous information about Chinese economy. Sir, a doubt will be cleared. After Chinese attack on Arunachal Pradesh, India, last year, India had imposed a trade blockade against China. According to your opinion, how much so far it affected both countries' economy and trade?
I think we need to understand that these kind of measures of whether you call it this kind of blockade or sanctions or whatever, these are merely temporary measures. And when you compare the India's economy with the Chinese economy is of a much larger size than India's economy. But if you ever try to question as to why if India's economy is smaller than China, why India use those blockades or India use those sanctions? The question is that these are more actions intended to send a message to the other country that certain policies tend to be harmful for the countries which are at the receiving end. But nonetheless, we also need to understand that China and India tend to be caught up in some kind of a rivalry in the so-called larger East Asian context, which includes Southeast Asia. And if you talk about India's Look-East policy, which has become Act-East policy, tends to be also aimed at trying to recover the lost ground in terms of India's influence that India used to enjoy in the so-called East Asia compared to what China enjoys today. So that way we find that India's policies of imposing blockades tend to be of somewhat little, tend to be of in the nature of some kind of a harm to India's economy that what it is, what it can be compared with China. I think, India needs to work much more strongly, much more efficiently to expand its own economy than merely try to dissipate its own resources in the name of so-called rivalry with China. And that is where we find that if India does not improve its own economy, there is a possibility that India would remain a kind of a second fiddle to China as China is growing and India does not seem to be growing.
Sir, one more question. What is the future of this blockade, sir, in long run?
Future of the long run, you understand that when you talk of the India and China trade deficit, you will know that India tends to have a kind of a huge deficit compared to the Chinese trade, compared to the China in terms of trade, and that is where we find that India has not been able to influence China to do more trade with India. And the question is, and that is how, because India is caught up with China in terms of geopolitical rivalry in the region, in the so-called East Asian region. India is trying to explore market in Africa, in Europe, and also in United States of America, where India thinks that probably with their support, with their larger market, India's economy can grow than what it is growing vis-a-vis that of China. I think India's economic policies will have to be a little more sounder, where India does not get caught up with some kind of rivalry with China, then what it can do when India remains a friendly power. I'm not saying that India should obey all the Chinese dictates, but the question is that as a trade, somewhere or other, if economic gain is your own target, then we need to give economy more preference than what we tend to do in case of politics. So somewhere in Indian context, as you know, since we are an emotional country, we tend to be not as hard-brained as East Asian brains are. I think we tend to be more emotional when we tend to attribute more importance to politics than what happens to economy. Somewhere or other, we need to also see that how our economic policies could be more balanced and could be more directed towards earning more economic dividend than what it is earning vis-a-vis that of China.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Very informative.
Thank you, bye.
அவ்வளவுதான் சார் கொஸ்டின்ஸ் வேற எதுவும் இல்லை. Sir, thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful, interesting, and very informative lecture. Actually, sir, from your lecture, it was clearly made us to understand about inward-looking policies of China, its brand strategies, China's policy pronouncement, and great power relations. Thank you so much, sir. And I think with this, we can wind up this session. And thank you so much, sir, for your interesting discussion also, sir. And tomorrow morning session will be handled by Dr. Jagannath Panda on China's Communist Party at 100 and India's security challenges. Tomorrow,
Thank you.
let's, meet in the same Zoom link at 9:55 a.m. Thank you. Thank you, Ananda. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. Thank you very much. Bye. Namaskar.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.